Die Frage, was Wissenschaft politisch leisten kann, insbesondere in globalen Krisen, beschäftigt natürlich nicht nur Hochschulen, sondern auch Stiftungen, Ministerien und natürlich Forscherinnen und Forscher überall auf der Welt. Ich freue mich, Ihnen für diese Diskussion nun 3 weitere Gäste vorstellen zu dürfen. And because one of them is not a German native speaker, we'll switch to English now. My first guest is head of the section Culture and Society at the Federal Foreign Office. His latest task was to prevent severe cutbacks on funding for our exchange organizations, such as DAD and Humboldt Foundation. Welcome, Ralf Beste. Historically seen, academic sanctions do not work. This is what she said in an interview a few months ago. She knows what she's talking about as she's a physicist and historian working on the history of science and technology at the University of Erlangen-Nürnberg. Welcome, Maria Rentetzi. My third guest, he says, we need a new strategy for science diplomacy. And please, let's stop talking about science as soft power. Please welcome the former State Secretary at the Federal Ministry for Education and Research and today's head of Volkswagen Foundation, Georg. And if you, dear audience, would like to join the discussion, please send me your questions via Slido, our app. I'll have them showing up here on my iPad. Maria Rentetzi, let's begin with defining what we're actually talking about. What does science, I have a typo on my card. It says silent diplomacy. Okay, I mean science diplomacy. What does it actually mean?
So you asked the difficult question. Whenever you ask someone in the humanities to define something, you get into trouble, we get into trouble because, as you know, definitions are very complex things in philosophy and history. So let me try. Science diplomacy. To my mind, science diplomacy is a set of practices that combine 2 fields, science and diplomacy. This probably doesn't say too much. In 2009-2010, the AAAS and the Royal Academy of the Sciences in Britain, they got together and they tried to give us a taxonomy, what exactly science diplomacy could be. So they gave us 3 ways to combine these 2 fields, as I said, science and diplomacy, science for diplomacy, science in diplomacy, and diplomacy for science. And since then, we have been debating what exactly this means. I don't want to get into too many details about defining this taxonomical, let's say, way of understanding science diplomacy. The only thing I want to say is that this is only one way to understand what science diplomacy is, and it comes from the practitioners. The people, if you go through the list of those that got together in 2009, and as I said before, most of them come from sectors like diplomats or people that do science policy. They were not people that came from universities or those that practice, let's say, within the university, scholars like professors. What does this mean? That this was oriented the very first way and to define what is science diplomacy came from the stakeholders that practice science diplomacy. We came very late, as scholars, we came very late to actually analyze what this is. And I can go on and on
maybe
about what this is from our perspective.
So maybe you can give us 1 or 2 examples where science diplomacy in history has actually helped to solve a political crisis. Or not helped.
Okay, good. This is a very instrumental way to understand the role of science in diplomacy. Your question presupposes that science is the tool that helps us solve problems, diplomatic problems. You are right, there have been many issues where science or scientists worked as the bridge to combine and help combine science and diplomacy and help solve problems when that was not able. The Iran deal, for example, if you read what was happening behind the curtains and behind the major meetings with the politicians, you see that those that helped resolve this issue were the physicists, the American guy, I don't remember names, the American guy and the Iranian guy that got together. They had already met at MIT and they were fellow students at MIT 10 years before, and then they met on the negotiation table to define what was going to happen there. So this is one of the examples that science can help diplomatic goals.
Ralf, Beste, what do you need science and university for in terms of German foreign policy? So what do you, politically speaking, expect from universities and researchers, even though Maria Rentetzi has been a critic of this kind of utilitaristic view on science?
Well, on a very general level, diplomacy is about managing and calibrating relations. And scientific relations, as cultural relations and other relations, are part of this huge bulk of relations. And so we spoke about, in the German language section before that, we spoke about what are the goals, like change, exchange, understanding. We think that science is contributing a lot to mutual understanding, to exchange of people, to establishing and maintaining relations on a people-to-people basis, far away from state-to-state basis. And that happens in universities and in institutes. And we think that more exchange brings better understanding, mutual understanding. That's the general take on it. And then when crises happen, we see that we come into a sphere that I would call applied science diplomacy, where we're suddenly challenged to say, what are we doing about these relations when we are in a crisis? And then it's also about calibrating the relations in a sense that we scale them down.
So Anna-Lena is calling some professors in a crisis and to hear what she should be doing?
No. She's, as Professor Mukherjee hinted, it was in this example that we all take as a starting point, the Russian attack on Ukraine. It was the science community that took a decision. The alliance organizations that did that, they consulted with us. So that's like the phone call you allude to. It's like not everybody is calling the minister in such a situation. That's what you have civil servants for. But so we were closely coordinating what our take was and what kind of relations needed a recalibration. But that's all in due respect of academic liberty that obviously everybody cherishes.
Georg Schütte, is it okay to use science cooperation as a tool for foreign policy? Or does it imply a cutback of academic freedom?
No, it's of course important, and we've seen that. You asked for prominent examples where science helped to establish political relations. The prime example from Germany is the early 1960s when the Max Planck Society started to establish relationships with Israel, and that was a precursor to the beginning of formal diplomatic relations. And this, however, continued throughout the next 50 years to be the legitimation to, in a very idealistic notion, say that any kind of academic and scientific collaboration will always lead to the improvement of relationships in general. And this, we had to learn the hard way, is no longer and probably has never been solidly the case. And we have to be aware of it. So I'm not arguing against academic relations. It's part of my professional history. I was involved with the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, and I'm extremely convinced that DAAD and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation are wonderful organizations, very helpful to establish ties to other societies, to other cultures, to other scientific communities. However, we have to be aware of the downsides of these relationships as well.
Maria Rentetzi, you have been a critic of the sanctions against Russia because you said they were too fast and too hard. Can you explain why you're a critic of this?
I'll give you an example. The day that the war started, I'm the internationalization officer of my university, and I got an email that asked me what my suggestions can be. What should we do? Should we impose sanctions within our own university? What should we do with our Russian students? And I didn't really have time to respond because by the end of the day, we had the state decision that we start imposing sanctions to Russia. My point there, I'm not a politician, and I don't have the solution, let's say, there. But I want to have a more critical perspective and say, give us time. Give us time to have a dialogue within our own universities, think and discuss what our position is, and then come back to you, the diplomats, the state, and I think this is the way to deal with a crisis like this.
What does science diplomacy then mean for a university, so for an institution or a foundation, or an organization such as DAD? And what does it mean for a scholar? For you personally, for example?
For me personally, I guess you asked me, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
For me personally, it's not a practice. It's a field for research. And I should, let's say, clarify this probably. As I said before, it started as a way from the practitioner's side to define what they do. For us, for scholars in universities, it started as a way to understand what kind of problems we deal with when we do our historical research. I'm a historian of science. I work mainly on nuclear history. And when, after the Cold War, of course, the period after the Second World War, during the Cold War, and when I tried to understand major nuclear challenges during this period, I realized that I have to understand what the relationship has been between scientists and diplomacy and scientists and diplomats. Otherwise, you don't understand the history of this period. And until then, historians of science, as me, we never focused on this part of the relationship. You talked about relationships as well, and diplomacy being about relationships. As historians, we had forgotten to look into these issues before. So for me, nuclear diplomacy, science diplomacy is a new field of research. It's new, absolutely new, and I hope that we can develop this further. And if you ask me what the role of science diplomacy in universities is also a double role. It's a practice. Universities are always have been and are about science diplomacy. We talked about the international students that we bring in. We open the doors of universities to international scholars. This is one part. And the other part is that we need to understand what science is and what diplomacy is when we combine these terms. There is little understanding of what science is, for example, in this discussion about science diplomacy.
So what is science and science diplomacy?
Again, the tough questions. We've heard before, especially during, I think it was during the panel on activism, someone said that science is not objective. And it's interesting to hear this in meetings like this, because when you go to meetings with scientists, this is out of the question. This is not something you hear a theoretical physicist, let's say, expressing. Science for theoretical physicists is not objective. You are talking about facts. But it's time to take account of the dynamic form of science, of how scientific knowledge changes, how scientific knowledge can be political, right? It has always been political. And there is no single definition of what science is, as there is no single definition of what the scientific fact is. Right now, and especially because of the corona pandemic, the climate change, and every other crisis that we have been discussing since this morning, so was that scientific facts are not what we thought that they are. They are objective, rational, and we cannot undermine them. This is not the case.
Georg Schütte, in March you published an op-ed in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung where you argued it's naive to think science diplomacy could be a form of soft power. Could you explain what's wrong with the metaphor of hard and soft power in politics and science diplomacy?
Well, soft power is a term that's often referred to, and it was coined by Joe Nye several years ago already, meaning that in addition to a hard power, which is military power and economic power, there is also a sort of cultural power that affects the attractiveness of nations and nation states. And so nations that do have a strong science and research systems can use this as a factor as a factor to establish international relations. And we did that. And we nourished the notion that by becoming an attractive partner in scientific exchanges, this might help to further improve also political relations. And it did work out. I'm not arguing against it. I was somebody who strongly supported this concept because it has a value that is proven by empirical evidence. However, if times change and academic and scientific relations become part of a larger political context in which hard power prevails, then soft power falls victim to hard power. And we have to acknowledge that. And it was Dieter Lenzen in an op-ed just recently who also described the individual dilemma of researchers. There are quite a number of German professors who retire in Germany and then get very good offers from, for example, Chinese universities in material science, in the hard sciences, in order to continue their academic career, which is, from an individual perspective, just wonderful. And we can talk about academic and personal freedom. However, and you cannot prevent it, however, people have to be aware of what's going to happen with the knowledge they create someplace else. And if you do this in China right now, in realms of research that do have implications for military technology, you should be aware of it and make a choice. These are tough choices between individual interests and collective interests, but we have to be aware of it. And it's no longer a decision that happens within the science system. It is a decision that happens within a larger political context, which is also framed by military and power relationships.
Ralf, Beste?
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for these clarification. I think it's interesting. Don't want to go too deeply into wordings, but soft power. Maybe what comes out of these deliberations is that science is more of a hard power than you might think. And that, I mean, the Iranian file. I mean, why do scientists have to solve this problem diplomatically? Because it's a scientific problem. It's research that brings upon scientific research in Iran, which is at the core of the problem. And you need scientific expertise to inspect, to control, and whatever. So this is very hard. What you suggest with your argumentation is that this soft power and also diplomacy is always about improving relations, but that's not necessarily the case. That's why I said it's about calibrating relations, and sometimes it goes the other way. If events turn sour, so do relations. I mean, there's almost every issue in international affairs that Winston Churchill said something about. So in this case too. He once was deliberating with his aides about signaling something to one country, and his civil servant, his diplomat said, "No, you can't do that, that would harm our relations." And he said, "Stuff your relations. What do we have them for if we don't use them?" And incidentally, that's something that we did, that the alliance organizations did. They used the relations for clear signaling. And that doesn't mean that these relations don't count, but that they do count. That's what I mean by applied science diplomacy, but it can always go south.
Mm-hmm.
If I can,
yeah.
I want to add something. The distinction and the division between the soft and hard power is a big debate right now, right? And whether science is in which side it belongs. If you work on nuclear history, you are absolutely convinced that science is hard power. There is no question. Even when UNESCO is discussing about science, and UNESCO is the softest you can get because it's all about culture and education, UNESCO is the first one that tries to deal with nuclear energy and atomic energy during this period. And they are exercising diplomacy in a very serious and hard way. So it's not only about culture. And the other example, again from history, when in 1956 the Americans sit together with the Russians, Indians, and other countries on the same table to discuss the establishment of the International Atomic Energy Agency, what the diplomats say is, wait, we cannot start the negotiations yet because our scientists are not here. This is the very first time that you see something like this, right? So can you distinguish between soft and hard power when the discussion is like this and in these terms? I don't think that you can.
Georg Schütte, what does this mean for your foundation, the work at the Volkswagen Foundation, for your funding scheme? You're funding scientists, researchers, but you have all kinds of programs. So how does this comes into your work, daily work?
It's probably a sideline because we identified rather thematic approaches to what kind of research we want to sponsor. And looking at this thematic focus, we then asked, where do we find international partners to deal with and what kind of collaboration do we want to offer? But if I may go back to the rather larger and general context, I would argue for a much more active mode than the reactive mode that we have right now. If things go sour, then we decide what to do or not to do. We need a forward strategy, and we do see that other countries pursue rather active, if not aggressive, forward strategies. In terms of science and innovation policy, they know what kind of key technologies they want to develop. They deliberately look for international partners to gather the knowledge they need to further advance companies' production sites back home. We need to define what kind of key technologies we need in order to assure welfare and adequate production modes. I'm not arguing for an economization of international science relationship, but I argue for a more self-determined way forward in which we know what kind of collaboration we want in which field. And of course, and this was what Shanili Randeria reminded us of this morning, we do need people who are able to see the world through the eyes of others. We need people who are able to take a different stance, to understand different cultures. So we certainly need this type of knowledge, and we have to think about ways how to acquire it if it is not possible to do this in a given country because of restrictive policies.
Ralf Beste, the Federal Foreign Office, talking about strategy, is working on a new China strategy right now. A first draft of this paper has been leaked by Der Spiegel. Experts have been extremely critical of this draft, as it suggests that we should cling to collaborations with China. And those experts say it's dangerous to do so, as Chinese universities are reporting directly to the Communist Party. Can you give us some insight into the work of at the Federal Foreign Office about this paper in terms of how do you consult universities, researchers about this field to get as much expertise about science diplomacy in this field?
Well, it's kind of difficult to comment on all the leakages. There's a new one today out of, so it's difficult to keep abreast of things. Right now, we thought this was an internal process at the start. Now everybody chips in, which is nice. So we get the intelligence of the many is really certainly contributing to a better result, and we appreciate that. And that, by the way, gives universities and researchers even more ability to do that, so that we consider this part of our strategy. We're flexible in that. So let's see what comes out of that. We first have a national security strategy that we want to decide, and we have a China strategy. There's others coming up. We have an innovation strategy that our colleagues, your former colleagues from the research ministry are preparing, and we try to make ends meet and have that go into each other, and we try to invite everybody. I mean, we as a foreign ministry aren't in the lead engaging with German universities because we respect the cooperation, the way that we do that with the research and education ministry. But of course we did roundtables. We try to have as many stakeholders on board in order to try to find out how to calibrate the relations. That's what I try to say is, of course we have interests in cooperation, and of course we need to differentiate. I mean, what Thorsten Benner said is like saying we look at Russia, and not only like as you suggested, we shouldn't only react and react to what Russian aggression is, but we should also take into consideration what future behavior of China might be like, and in which respect do we contribute to that, or could we influence that? And that's what we're, of course, discussing with universities, with researchers, and try to come to a position that takes into consideration the whole range of our interests that we have. And that is also economic interests, that is security interests, and so it's not a purely scientific endeavor, but it has to be across the board. And that's why we also need, and we need a bit of time for that, to put it into the framework of our security strategy, because of course, science is political, like the nuclear file history shows, and we have to be careful and cooperative, but not stupid.
Maria Rentetzi, we're talking about science diplomacy, and this is, so we're talking about science in a very sciencey, techie way. We had also a question coming up, which we can't discuss in full length, about dual use. But so also an important part of this discussion. But I wonder, what is about the humanities in this?
Thanks for this question. One of my points is that we need to change our universities the way that Dr. Suter was talking before, but we also need to change our universities in terms of interdisciplinarity. So it's not only making them more international, but make them more interdisciplinary. This is my major problem, my major issue in my own university. Probably I'm the last one to talk about German universities because I just joined one. So I don't know your culture very well, but my experience right now is that if I want to teach my courses that are highly interdisciplinary, I have to go door by door to every dean and say, do you want to include my course in your program? There is no way to do this differently, so this is one of the major challenges that the universities have today. Also, you talk, I think the question is about the dual use of nuclear power, right? This is the major issue. And this is where the International Atomic Energy Agency comes in and its role, because right now this agency does both. Tries to promote nuclear energy and at the same time tries to safeguard, and this is actually the word that they use, safeguard nuclear agency. To my mind, and it's not only to my mind, there has been discussion about this. It's time to have this split and have two probably international organizations that take care of these different aspects of nuclear energy, but this is a major and big discussion, and probably I'm not the one that should decide something like this. Diplomats are in a much better position to do it. But this is a suggestion that comes from people that work with nuclear energy, actually. We had a workshop on science diplomacy 2 days ago. We had someone from the Federal Ministry for Nuclear Safety and Security here, and this is what his suggestion was as well. So it comes also from the practitioners and not only from the scholars.
Mm-hmm. We're having the final question already, and I want to talk very quickly about Iran. We have been talking about this before in the Thesenduell. So how can academic support look like? Science diplomacy for a university, for a foundation, for a scholar in the times of upheaval we see in Iran right now. Maybe you can quickly say something about that.
Support those who have to leave the country, try to maintain bridges to those who are inside the country to receive information and build up political pressure on the regime. And don't be naive. Iran has a double structure of a political administration, and then it's the Revolutionary Guards and the presidential system, which is a religious dictatorship. Let's be aware of the dual structure of that political system, and let's be aware of whom we talk to. But maintain ties, support the individuals.
Maria Rentetzi?
I was thinking that it's time to do what we call the under the radar relations, and especially professors in universities should keep the doors open. Just a very quick example, what should I do? It's a question. What should I do with Sergei and Milada? And these are real people that I have been collaborated with in so many years in international venues of my discipline. What should I do with them? Just close the door? I think we should keep the doors open, at least from my point of view.
Ralf, Beste?
Well, that's actually, I mean, that's what we've been talking about in the two discussions. There's one thing, how to signal that you want to use your relations in order to show that you don't agree and maybe put pressure and in a sanctions way, on the respective country, Iran, in that way, and on the other side, your self-interest in maintaining relations because you want to engage and help those that are in need of your help and are like-minded, and that's why we have the protection schemes initiatives together with DAAD and Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung for scientists, for students, open, and we try to increase the resources that we can allot to that in order to help scientists from Iran and students from Iran that are in need and need to leave, to help them to cope. And in the meantime, we try to maintain the relations under the circumstances given and dictated by the regime that you so aptly described.
Ralf, Beste, Maria, Rentetzi, Georg, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.